Being the other woman is a bitter, lonely life.
My kids need me.
What about this kid?
Some turn rejection into rage. A girl from the streets plays Russian roulette with a married man.
For the first time in years, she was living the high life. She had it made.
A teen mom-to-be lashes out at her rival.
You stay out of this!
It was just the ultimate episode of jealousy.
I wish I could stay here forever.
And one woman's obsession with another tears a family in two.
Get off me!
She would have done anything to ensure that they could live happily ever after together.
These dwell on the fringes.
She was the girl who was trying to find something better, didn't know how to get there.
Love can be cheap.
All Brandita wanted was someone to love her.
You threatening me?
And life even cheaper.
She knew that something awful was going to happen.
In Sylmar, in the San Fernando Valley, California, 1988, 52-year-old Joan Dolly's job is to bring joy to others.
She worked at the Hallmark store, so you can imagine she was a part of a lot of people's happiest moments as they go in there and buy their cards.
Dennis has been acting weird lately.
But Joan's own Hallmark moments are few and far between.
I think he's having an affair.
Are you sure, Joan?
Her 32-year marriage to childhood sweetheart Dennis is losing its luster.
Dennis was retired Air Force. He looked like just the average Joe, the family man. He had kids at home.
Why were you so late last night?
An old friend turned up at the club.
Oh, really? An old friend.
As Dennis drifts away, Joan pulls on the purse strings.
You've been going through money like water.
Joan really kept tight reins on Dennis.
I earn it.
Not as much as you spend.
Dennis complained to people that his wife just controlled him. That, he wanted to buy certain things. He wanted a boat. He wanted a jacuzzi. She would always hold the purse strings. She'd always say, no, 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 no. You can't have that.
To earn a little spending money of his own, Dennis takes a part-time job at the local golf course.
People saw Dennis as a happily married man, but they didn't know about his secret life.
In his spare time, Dennis enjoys more vigorous pursuits.
Dennis frequented the prostitutes on Sepulveda Boulevard up in the San Fernando Valley, not far from their home.
Today, Dennis won't even have to leave work. 31-year-old Brandita Taliano walks right into his life.
Brandita was kind of a typical street prostitute, worked in the San Fernando Valley.
Hi. Do you work here?
I sure do, sweetheart.
Brandita is a heroin addict from the wrong side of the tracks.
She was the girl who was trying to find something better, but didn't know how to get there.
Maybe I'll call you sometime.
Do that.
Oh, you betcha.
Dennis does call, and Brandita sees her new customer as a ticket off the streets.
Here was this guy, this Air Force guy, this golf course guy who had a nice house. And maybe she felt, you know what? Maybe this is my turn.
Brandy revels in this extravagant new life. As the months go by, the bill goes up.
Something was happening with Brandy and Dennis far beyond a hooker and a John. I mean, he paid for her apartment, he bought her food, he got her a car.
Dennis spends all his time
They're an expensive habit.
and money away from home. 55-year-old Joan has had enough. In 1991, she's handed a ticket to freedom.
Joan had inherited $70,000 from her mother passing away.
And because it was left as an inheritance, it meant that it was all hers. She didn't have to share it with her husband. So that was her way out.
You're not getting the house.
Yeah, we'll see about that.
She was prepared now to move forward with the divorce because she could then afford to maintain her lifestyle without very much change.
So you expect to get all of your inheritance plus half of my assets?
Divorce means Dennis will lose everything he holds dear, his money and his mistress.
I think Dennis realized his financial life was about to be seriously affected.
He didn't want to be left with nothing. He didn't want to split his pension with her.
You threatening me?
Yeah, I am.
Dennis desperately wanted to prevent his wife from divorcing him because it would have financially devastated him.
On a spring morning in 1991, one of Joan's co-workers calls at their home.
Mrs. Dolly did not show up at the Hallmark store to work.
Joan!
Her friend, who was the owner,
Anybody home?
became deeply concerned and was unable to rouse anybody at the door.
So she let herself in the house and found Joan's body.
Joan has been bludgeoned to death. It looks like a bungled robbery.
The assumption is, well, burglars broke in and she was startled awake, interfered with the burglary, and they killed her to avoid her being a witness.
Under Joan's fingernails, forensics find human tissue from her attacker. But in 1991, DNA tracing is in its infancy.
They knew there was DNA there, and they'd hoped someday maybe that DNA would provide the answers to what happened.
Joan's husband, Dennis, had an early start at the golf course. The police call him home to break the sad news.
Dennis basically doesn't know anything at all about it. He has no clue how this could possibly happen.
Did your wife appear stressed?
Dennis is not behaving like a man in mourning.
He was absent a lot of emotion that one would expect because your wife of 35 years had simply been brutalized in this fashion.
Days after his wife is buried, Dennis seeks solace in Sin City.
You got this in the bag.
I mean, this was his wife of 35 years. Who does that? Who goes on a Las Vegas holiday right after she's been brutally murdered?
Casino surveillance cameras catch Dennis with a special someone. The police want to know who.
And they're thinking, who is she? I mean, his wife just died. Who's this gal he's hanging around with?
That woman was eventually identified as Brandita. Brandita was living the high life. He was taking her to Vegas, buying things. She had it made.
But before long, Brandy's glittering world will come crashing down.
They searched her apartment and found a bunch of jewelry. Guess who that jewelry used to belong to?
It's the winter of 1993 in LA. For 2 years, Brandita Taliano and her sugar daddy, Dennis Dolly, live it up. Thanks to an inheritance from Dennis's murdered wife, Joan.
2 years after a crime has passed, is enough time for the perpetrator to become comfortable, to think that maybe they got away with it.
But their party is about to end. Brandita is arrested on a drugs charge.
Brandy gets arrested, and when she gets arrested, the cops think about that old case involving Joan's murder, and they think also about the advances in DNA.
By now, DNA analysis is common. The tissue found under Joan's nails matches Brandy's DNA, and there's something else tying her to the crime.
During the course of her detention there, they discovered all this jewelry in the bottom of her purse. And it just happened to be Joan Dolly's jewel.
Big job. And did Brandy know anybody?
His name's Gary. He'll do it for the money.
And Brandy came back with a couple of ideas, a couple of gang members from LA.
The big job is to kill Dennis's wife.
She sleeps on that side. I don't care what you do to her. You can rape her, beat her, whatever, so long as she's dead.
Dennis tells the two men he's employed to murder his wife of many, many years, the mother of his children, that they can go ahead and rape her if they want to. Just make sure she's dead when it's over. He hated her.
But one of the potential hitmen is arrested on an unrelated charge.
Which put an end to this plan because the two gang members needed each other to do the job, so it halted the plan.
With his divorce looming, Dennis is on a deadline.
It became urgent that he do something quickly.
When his low-class lover is released from jail, Dennis has the answer.
Dennis decides to take matters into his own hands, and he needs some help. He needs Brandy. So he tells Brandy to come over late at night, and he lets her inside.
He probably promised her she'd be the next Mrs. Dolly. And she wanted out of her situation.
Dennis Dolly was armed with a golf club. Mrs. Dolly was asleep in the master bedroom. I don't think she suspected anything until she was startled awake in her bedroom to see Dennis wielding a golf club, this strange woman.
To get the life she wants, Brandita must take Jones.
Brandy grabs her and holds her down.
And that's how Brandita's DNA ended up under the nails of Mrs. Dolly.
She's dead?
I think so.
They then scrambled through the house, tossed everything.
They just sort of set the stage in a very poor way that a robbery had gone wrong.
They've stolen Joan's life. Now they squander her inheritance.
Dennis spent his ill-gotten gains on a boat, a jacuzzi, a waterbed, and a gazebo. That's what Joan's life and their marriage was worth to him.
With money as a powerful motive and damning DNA evidence, Brandita Taliano and her lover Dennis are charged with the murder of Joan Dolly.
He was the most average guy in the world. No one could believe that inside of him was the ability to be this evil.
In 1997, Dennis Dolly is convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. He dies in prison 6 years later.
I don't think Dennis loved Brandy. I don't think he loved Joan. I don't think he loved anything or anyone. Dennis was all about himself.
Brandita Taliano is also convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life. Brandy and Dennis had very different aspirations, but they'd both stop at nothing to get their way.
All Brandita wanted was heroin and someone to love her. All Dennis wanted was someone to have sex with and to help him kill his wife, Joan. And then they met.
A love triangle has 3 sides.
Both of these women knew they were sharing the same man.
My kids need me.
But when that triangle folds,
I gotta go.
Nadia went after the person that she thought had ruined her chance of happiness.
desperation takes over.
Hi, can I help you?
It was a very personal attack, which was driven by rage and jealousy.
Newark, New Jersey, early 2009. Sharon Mowens and Kenny Jones look the picture of happiness.
Kenneth Jones was involved in a long, approximately 8 to 8.5 year relationship with Sharon Mowens.
But the couple has recently split.
They had an argument, some sort of a fight, the result of which was that Kenneth Jones moved out.
Sharon wants a break.
Kids, we gotta go. Come on, let's go.
But Kenny is keen to reconcile.
He loved Sharon. He wanted to be back there with her. Quickly, he moved in with her.
Kenny finds comfort in the arms of this younger woman.
I think he probably enjoyed the attention of having the two women interested in him.
And he's happy to pay his way.
I think he provided for her financially, at least to some extent. Nadia was very much in love with Kenneth Jones.
So in love, she doesn't mind sharing.
He had told Ms. Venable from the start that he was always going to be going back to Sharon Mowens, that even though they're separated, he didn't consider that separation to be final.
Nadia was the other woman.
Nadia thinks she knows how to win Kenny's heart.
She became pregnant.
I think we should call him Kenny.
You sure it's a boy, huh?
Far from bringing Nadia and Kenny closer, her pregnancy drives them apart.
What time?
I think the relationship between Kenneth Jones and Nadia Venable was also a lot of back and forth. I think that there was tension between them because of the presence of Sharon Mowens still being in their life.
I'll pick him up. I gotta pick my kids up after school.
Why can't she do it, Kenny?
She has to work. They're my kids too.
Kenneth apparently did like the excitement of being in a love triangle. This one got a little too exciting.
I thought you couldn't live with her, Kenny.
My kids need me.
What about this kid? Kenny!
In April 2010,
I gotta go.
Nadia loses the tug of war when Kenny reconciles with his wife and decides to return home.
The news that he was going back to Sharon came as a complete shock to her.
I think that when Kenneth Jones went back to Sharon, she felt probably very devastated.
Nadia is not just heartbroken. She's also left flat broke.
The electricity bill was due. They were cutting it off. Their phone had been cut off for approximately a week.
He left her high and dry. 6 months pregnant, no money to pay the bills.
As Kenny and Sharon rekindle their relationship,
Oh, heck no.
Nadia's rage smolders.
Kenny, you need to pay these bills. You need to stay out of our lives.
Nadia hated Sharon. Both of these women knew they were sharing the same man, and they had had a few run-ins.
Go!
Kenneth left Nadia in dire straits. Desperate, pregnant women can be dangerous.
Nadia concocts a plan.
What are you making?
She wants to scare off her competition.
Nadia went after the person that she thought had ruined her chance of happiness.
She enlists her 15-year-old cousin to help.
They took Clorox bleach, they poured it into 2 empty spice containers. They decided to go to Sharon Mowens' house, basically to beat her up was their intention.
Nadia's jealous, jilted, and has nothing to lose.
I think she believed that the only way that she could ever get him back was to take Sharon Mowens out of the picture altogether.
Newark, May 15th, 2010. It's the day before Mother's Day. 29-year-old Sharon Mowens has plenty of chores to do, while her partner, Kenny Jones, is at work.
It was a quiet afternoon at Sharon Mowens' house. They were playing music. She was cleaning. Her 3- and 6-year-old boys were playing with their toys.
Mom. Oh, did you make that at school today?
Yes.
Oh, but you know you're not supposed to give this to me until tomorrow.
Oh.
Sharon's not expecting any visitors today. But there's someone at the door. Kenny's ex-lover, 20-year-old Nadia Venable, and her teenage cousin.
Putting her cousin in front of her was a decoy. It was to make sure that they would be able to gain entry into that apartment.
Sharon's daughter doesn't recognize the caller.
Hi.
And that's exactly what Nadia Venable wants.
They asked, is Sweetie there? Sweetie being Sharon's nickname. As they were asking that, Sharon herself came to the door.
Can I help you?
Nadia and her cousin threw bleach in Sharon's face that immediately disabled their victim.
And then just started mercilessly punching and beating her until she fell to the floor. There was a struggle that led into the kitchen. Sharon grabbed a knife to defend herself, but it was taken from her and she was stabbed repeatedly.
It was a very personal attack, which was driven by rage and jealousy.
Sharon's only thoughts are for her children.
I imagine she wanted to protect her children, didn't want them to see what was happening, and at the same time, fight for her life.
For Nadia, it is mission accomplished.
It shows how desperate she must have been to carry this out in such a brutal way. She must have just known what she wanted to do that day, and nothing stopped her.
Let's go!
Nadia and her cousin flee the scene, leaving Sharon mortally wounded.
Sharon was stabbed 27 times. It was necessary for Nadia to obliterate her enemy.
Ms. Mowens managed to crawl out of her apartment. She collapsed right outside of her door, right in the foyer where her neighbors found her.
Sharon's daughter calls 911. She also tells the police she knew the attacker.
Sharon's 10-year-old was able to identify her and tell the police who did it.
The next day, the police issue an alert for Nadia. Never imagining the murderer will come to them.
Can I help you?
Yeah, my car's been stolen.
Okay, what was your name?
Nadia Venable?
Police ultimately caught Nadia Venable because her car was actually towed. And so she went to the police station and said, you know, my car's been stolen. And the police said, no, you're under arrest for the murder of Sharon Mowens.
Will you come with me, please?
On trial for murder, Nadia tries to lay the blame on her cousin, but the jury believes otherwise.
Ultimately, jurors believed that Nadia Venable, who had the motive, who was so angry, devised this plan, looped her cousin in with her, drove over with the purpose of beating this woman up, and then at some point
role until 2060.
Nadia got what she wanted, Sharon out of the picture. But Nadia will spend the rest of her life in prison.
Just 10 months after her conviction, Nadia dies behind bars of a seizure, leaving innocent victims behind.
I don't think any person with half a heart could, A, kill someone, but B, do it with their kids just standing there. It was just the ultimate episode of jealousy and what it can do to a person.
Multiple lives were profoundly affected by this murder. 3 young children, 1 unborn child. A young mother is dead, and a man is without his family or his girlfriend over jealousy.
Love is a powerful force.
A passionate and intense relationship.
It can bring people together.
She would have done anything to ensure that they could live happily ever after together.
Get out. And tear them apart.
Get out!
She needed to eliminate him for her own happiness.
"100 miles north of Sydney, Australia, in the quiet town of Maitland, 2007. Renee Burns prepares for a family barbecue.
Steve, can you please give me a hand?
Her partner, 30-year-old Stephen Quire, dotes on their kids, but he struggles to please Renee.
Stephen worked hard, brought home his paycheck, supported his family. He was described by others as a normal, hard-working guy.
Stephen has 1 child with Renee and is stepfather to another.
Stephen Quire had taken over the role of the father to the child of Renee Burns, and it's quite clear that that child worshipped the ground he walked on.
He loved her, and he raised her little girl as if she was his own.
Their guests today are Stephen's sister Amanda and her new partner, 23-year-old Tanya Lane.
Through that relationship is how she fostered relationships with both Stephen Quire and Renee Burns.
Over the next few months, Tanya becomes close to the couple. Renee cherishes this exciting new friendship. Because her own relationship is disintegrating.
I'm not a tea towel.
Oh, come on, my hands are dry.
Get off me.
What's your problem?
You.
They argued a lot, they fought a lot. Neighbours said they heard them fighting a lot. They went to great lengths to conceal the relationship. They purchased mobile phones.
That one is yours. Don't let Steve see it, okay?
Duh.
For the specific use of communicating with each other.
Hello?
Hi, sexy. Want to come over to my place?
Yes.
Renee Burns had commenced a relationship with Tanya Lane, a passionate and intense relationship.
I wish I could stay here forever.
You can.
Tanya is head over heels.
What about the girls?
But Renee won't leave her kids. For Tanya, a part-time lover is not enough.
Tanya Lane was besotted with Renee Burns and would have done anything to keep the relationship going.
On December 23rd, 2008, Tanya asks for a meeting with her lover's partner, Stephen. Intrigued to know what's going on, Stephen agrees to a late-night walk.
They walked away from houses They walked away from where people might be able to see what was going on. All of a sudden, this four-wheel drive emerged.
A man got out and shot Steve in the head.
The gunman turns to Tanya. He doesn't shoot her. He abducts her.
She was only detained for a matter of minutes before this man wearing the balaclava released her.
There was no demand for ransom and she wasn't hurt.
Incredibly, Stephen survives the shooting. But the police can't trace the gunman.
No one was ever arrested or charged in relation to the shooting.
Hey, Dad, we're really hungry.
I'm gonna order pizza.
If Stephen expects sympathy from Renee, he doesn't get it. Instead, he's left to deal with the kids while their mom is missing in action.
Steve was very frustrated and angry.
Where have you been?
Met up with Tanya. Went for a drink.
A drink? It's been 4 hours.
We got talking. I actually had some fun for a change.
The relationship deteriorated.
Some fun? Why, you thinking of changing sides?
You're pathetic.
Stephen doesn't realize how close he's come to the truth. Tanya's concocting a way to have Renee all to herself.
Love triangles can be, and frequently are, dangerous.
January 2010, the country town of Maitland, Australia. Lovers Renee Burns and Tanya Lane are trying to keep their affair quiet, but they can't hide their passion.
Tanya Lane was there a lot of the time, and a lot of their neighbours and friends suspected that something was going on.
It's him. He's early. Get dressed.
Renee Burns' partner, Stephen Quire, ignores the gossip until he comes face to face with the truth.
Steve,
What the hell?
she doesn't love you. It's over. Steve, let it go. Get out. Go. Ted, go. Get out.
Stephen Quire banned her, said that he didn't want Tanya Lane ever coming back to the house again.
Oh, well, aren't you just the hero, you big man?
When Steve found out that Renee was involved intimately with Tanya, Steve and Renee began to fight not only verbally, but physically.
Stephen is now convinced of one thing. Tanya was behind the attempt on his life.
Stephen believed that Tanya Lane had lured him to that location.
Steve believed that Tanya had been the one that shot him, but he stayed around. He forbid Renee to see Tanya.
The two lovers can't bear to be parted.
You okay?
Yeah. Kind of.
Leave it to me.
In late February 2010, Tanya and Renee finally get their wish.
Renee Burns moved out of the house and moved in with Tanya Lane.
Can I get you water?
But their newfound bliss is shattered when police come knocking.
So when did you last see Stephen?
They bring sad news.
Stephen's dead.
Stephen Quire has been found dead.
His body was in a state of decomposition at the time it was found in the national park.
He had a gunshot wound to the chest and has been dead for weeks.
Our focus was, well, who is Stephen Quire and why would someone want him dead?
Why are you asking?
His former partner, Renee, seems unfazed. She and the kids haven't seen Stephen for a month.
I thought he'd left.
The least Renee could have done was report her husband missing to the police, but that didn't occur to her.
The police smell a rat.
They were very suspicious immediately that both women were involved.
There's no evidence linking either woman to the killing. Until detectives discover Tanya Lane has recently been shopping for a gun. An ex-con tells cops he supplied her with a unique weapon.
He said I was able to obtain a gun for her and sold it to her for $700.
It was a World War II flare gun that had been modified to fire shotgun ammunition.
Tanya Lane is charged with murder. The police believe Renee lied to protect her lover, and she's charged as an accessory to murder.
Both Tanya Lane and Renee Burns colluded between each other to invent false stories as to the potential whereabouts of Stephen.
With both women proclaiming their innocence, prosecutors must piece together Tanya's murder plot.
She planned this killing. She travelled to the home of Renee Burns and Stephen Quire late in the evening. She went into the house.
Tanya Lane was desperately in love with Renee Burns and would have done anything to ensure that they could live happily ever after together.
After the murder, Tanya dumps Steve's body and the gun. In court, Tanya insists she's innocent. But in prison, it's a different story.
Tanya Lane had made a telephone call from jail where she admitted that she was the shooter.
Her own words seal Tanya's fate. In August 2013, she changes her plea to guilty and is sentenced to 17 years behind bars. Renee Burns pleads guilty to accessory to murder after the fact. She receives 4 years in prison.
Renee Burns definitely knew about the killing, but the evidence is fairly sparse as to where she was and what she knew and when.
Tanya's dream of being with Renee comes true when they are briefly incarcerated together.
So it certainly appeared that the relationship continued whilst they were on remand and in jail together.
It's a final disrespect to the memory of Stephen Quire, a loving father who stood in the way of a wicked obsession.
Steve was an obstacle. Tanya needed to eliminate him for her own happiness. And that's what she did.
These deadly women would do anything to be number one. Brendita Taliano thought murder would bring romance and riches. Nadia Venable tried to reclaim her lover by eliminating her rival. And Tanya Lane destroyed the one obstacle in her path to happiness.
The file is thin, almost weightless, yet it carries the gravity of a city that has been holding its breath for more than 40 years, and it begins with a single line typed on yellowing paper. Berlin, winter of 1981. A woman leaves her apartment and never comes back. There is no scream on record, no eyewitness willing to swear to what they saw, only a street dusted with old snow and the echo of footsteps that dissolve somewhere between a tram stop and the dark mouth of an alley, and from that moment the city fractures into before and after. Neighbors whispering behind curtains, police radios hissing through the night, headlines using a phrase that will not let go, cold case, even though at the time no one wants to believe it will grow cold at all. West Berlin is still an island then, wrapped in concrete and wire, a place where disappearances feel heavier, more claustrophobic, because there is nowhere to escape to without being seen, and yet she vanishes as if the city itself has swallowed her. 34 years old, office worker. Routine-bound, last seen wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather bag that will never be found. The apartment door is locked, the bed neatly made, a cup left unwashed in the sink, suggesting interruption rather than departure, and investigators photograph everything with clinical detachment, unaware that these images will be revisited decades later by eyes searching for meaning in shadows and reflections. Outside, the building's residents gather in clusters, some crying, some defensive, everyone suddenly aware of how little they know about the people living just meters away, and the first rumors begin to circulate before the patrol cars have even left the block. A secret lover. A Stasi connection. A voluntary disappearance. Each theory burns bright for a moment and then collapses under the weight of its own speculation, leaving only the cold fact of absence. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months, and the search expands from stairwells and basements to parks, canals, abandoned lots near the wall, dogs straining against their leashes, divers cutting through black water, while flashbulbs pop on the banks, but nothing surfaces except questions. And the case file thickens with dead ends and crossed-out leads. Detectives interview coworkers who describe her as quiet, reliable, almost invisible, a description that now feels obscene, as if invisibility itself could explain what happened, and they talk to neighbors who remember arguments, or think they do, memory already bending under pressure, reshaping itself to fit the shape of tragedy. One man insists he heard footsteps running late that night. Another recalls a car idling too long. A third swears she saw her speaking to someone near the corner, a silhouette without a face, and each statement is logged, indexed, and slowly buried under the next wave of information that goes nowhere. The media sent blood, splashing her photograph across front pages, asking how a woman can disappear in a city under constant surveillance, how a cold case can be born so quickly, and the word sticks, repeating itself until it becomes a kind of verdict. Inside the police department, confidence erodes quietly, resources are reassigned, senior officers move on, junior detectives inherit a puzzle with missing pieces and fading ink, and somewhere along the way a small item is bagged, labeled, and shelved without ceremony. A forgotten clue in a room full of forgotten things. Years pass. Berlin changes its skin. The wall falls, streets are renamed, buildings demolished, lives rebuilt, but the case remains frozen in 1981, a photograph trapped behind glass, revisited only on anniversaries when journalists need a ghost story and investigators need to prove they have not given up. The victim's family ages in public view, hope turning brittle, their statements shorter, more careful, until eventually there is no one left willing to speak on camera, only a grave without answers and a city that has learned how to live with unresolved violence. Inside the archives, the file gathers dust, its margins annotated by different hands from different eras, each generation of detectives convinced they might see what the others missed, and each time the same pattern repeats, renewed energy, a brief flare of possibility. And then the slow realization that every promising lead leads back to the same silence. A witness recants. A suspect's alibi hardens with time. Physical evidence degrades, technology outpaces what was once cutting edge, and the case is reclassified, downgraded, its urgency measured not by danger, but by nostalgia. Yet something about it refuses to die. Perhaps it is the simplicity of the disappearance, or the absence of spectacle, or the way it mirrors a city that itself was divided and uncertain, but every few years someone pulls the box from the shelf again, fingers tracing the typed lines, wondering how a life can evaporate without leaving a ripple strong enough to follow. In the early 2000s, a new unit takes a systematic look at Berlin's oldest cold cases, feeding names into databases that did not exist when the ink was still wet, cross-referencing patterns, timelines, coincidences that once required human memory, now delegated to machines. And the 1981 disappearance is scanned, digitized, reduced to data points blinking on a screen. Nothing happens. No match. No hit. The file is closed again, this time with a heavier click, as if the metal drawer itself understands finality. And then, years later, almost by accident, during a routine review triggered by an unrelated investigation, someone notices an inconsistency so small it would be laughable if it were not deadly serious, a detail overlooked not because it was hidden, but because it seemed too ordinary to matter. A note in the margin. An object listed but never fully examined. A timestamp that does not quite align. It sits there quietly, waiting, while outside the city hums, unaware that a past it thought was sealed is about to breathe again. The forgotten clue does not announce itself with drama. It does not glow or scream for attention. It simply exists, stubborn and unchanged, and when it is finally isolated, the effect is immediate and unsettling, like realizing a room has always had another door. Files are reopened. Old addresses are traced. Names long dismissed are spoken aloud again, this time with a different weight, and the word cold case begins to shift in tone, from resignation to anticipation. Somewhere in Berlin, a man who has lived freely for decades feels a tremor without knowing why, a disturbance in the narrative he has told himself about the past, while investigators move carefully, aware that one wrong step could collapse everything. The community that once gathered in shock gathers again, older now, more skeptical, watching as police vehicles return to familiar streets, cameras following, headlines sharpening their language, hinting at closure without promising it. The case that defined an era of failure threatens to redefine it as something else entirely, and the question that has lingered since 1981 rises once more, heavier, sharper, impossible to ignore. What really happened on that winter night? And why did it take so long for the truth to begin pushing its way back into the light? The first ripple spreads quietly through the department, a change in posture, a lowering of voices, because everyone who has worked cold cases knows this moment is dangerous, the moment when hope returns and threatens to distort judgment. And yet the detail cannot be unseen now that it has been noticed, a procedural note buried deep in the 1981 paperwork that lists an item recovered near the route she was believed to have taken, catalogued, photographed once, and then effectively abandoned by the momentum of bigger theories. It is mundane on the surface, the kind of object that fills evidence lockers by the thousands, but when compared against modern databases it begins to glow with relevance, not metaphorically but statistically, the numbers refusing to stay quiet. The investigators who circle this discovery are not the romantic kind. No dramatic gestures, no raised voices, only the steady hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of pages turning, because they have learned that breakthroughs often arrive disguised as clerical errors. They trace the object's chain of custody and find gaps that should not exist, signatures missing, dates rounded off, and with every inconsistency the past feels less settled, more porous, as if someone long ago had nudged the truth just far enough out of alignment to make it invisible. The city outside remains indifferent, but inside the archive room the air feels charged, and someone makes the call to reopen interviews that were considered exhausted before the wall even fell. The first door they knock on belongs to a man who once lived 2 floors below the victim, now gray-haired, cautious, his memory filtered through decades of normal life, and when they mention her name, he pauses just long enough to reveal that it still carries weight. He repeats the story he told in 1981 about hearing nothing unusual, about keeping to himself, about a building where everyone minded their own business, but when they slide a photograph across the table, not of the victim but of the object, his eyes flicker. A microexpression that would have gone unnoticed in another era, and suddenly the interview shifts from routine to surgical. He says he does not recognize it. The file says he did. The contradiction hangs there, heavy and unresolved, and when he asks why they are here now, after all this time, no one answers directly. They do not need to. The implication does the work for them. Word leaks, as it always does, and soon the press is circling again, recycling phrases with a sharpened edge. Forgotten clue, dramatic development, cold case re-examined. For the victim's remaining relatives, the news lands like an aftershock, not relief, not anger, but a weary alertness, the reflex of people who have been disappointed too many times to trust momentum. They agree to speak to detectives once more, pulling out boxes of old letters, calendars, receipts, artifacts of a life that ended without explanation, and among these fragments is a detail that never quite fit the official timeline, a meeting penciled in and then crossed out. A phone number with no name beside it. It had been mentioned once, dismissed as irrelevant, but now it is photographed, scanned, added to the growing digital map that overlays the analog past. Patterns begin to emerge, not clean answers, but clusters of possibility that point away from the sensational theories that once dominated the headlines and towards something more intimate, more unsettling. The investigation pivots, narrowing its focus to a handful of individuals who intersected with her life in unremarkable ways, people who do not look like villains in retrospect, which is precisely what makes them dangerous. One of them is a former coworker, remembered as polite, diligent, forgettable, who left the company shortly after her disappearance and built a quiet life elsewhere, a man whose name appears in the file just often enough to be ignored. When detectives finally sit across from him, decades after their first brief exchange, the atmosphere is almost cordial, small talk filling the space while recording equipment hums unobtrusively. He expresses sympathy. He says he barely knew her. He says time has blurred everything. But when asked about a specific afternoon in late winter of 1981, his answer's slow, syllables stretching, memories suddenly selective, and the object is introduced into the conversation not as an accusation, but as a point of clarification. His reaction is delayed, but it arrives with force, a tightening of the jaw, a breath taken too late, and for the first time the investigators feel they are no longer chasing shadows, but casting one. They leave the interview without handcuffs, without confrontation, but with a sense of trajectory that had been missing for decades. Surveillance begins quietly, respectful of legal boundaries but relentless in its patience, and what they find is not dramatic behavior but a pattern of avoidance. Old addresses that do not quite line up, gaps in employment histories explained away by vague references to travel or illness. None of it is illegal. All of it is suggestive. Meanwhile, forensic technicians revisit the forgotten clue with tools unimaginable in 1981, extracting data from surfaces long thought inert, and the results come back slowly, then all at once, transforming speculation into something closer to fact. A profile emerges, partial but compelling, and when it is run against national databases the response is immediate, a match that lights up the screen and forces the room into silence. The name attached to it is familiar now, uncomfortably so, and suddenly the past feels very close, pressing in from all sides. The decision to move forward is not unanimous. Senior officials caution restraint, mindful of the damage caused by premature conclusions, especially in cases resurrected from the dead. But the evidence has a gravity that resists delay, and warrants are prepared with meticulous care, every line justified, every inference supported, because they know the world will be watching. When the arrest finally happens, it is almost anticlimactic, a knock on a door in a quiet neighborhood far from the original scene, a man opening it with mild surprise that curdles into recognition as he sees the badges. Cameras capture the moment from a distance, headlines exploding within minutes. Berlin 1981 cold case closed. Dramatic arrest after 40 years, and the city reacts with a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction, as if closure were a commodity long overdue. But beneath the surface celebration, unease spreads. The suspect maintains his innocence with practiced calm, offering explanations that are plausible enough to unsettle those who want certainty, and as pretrial details trickle out, inconsistencies appear not only in his story, but in the investigation itself. Defense attorneys seize on procedural gaps from the original inquiry, arguing that time has corrupted memory and evidence alike, that the forgotten clue is being asked to carry more weight than it can bear. The public, drawn back into the case by the promise of resolution, begins to fracture into camps, some convinced justice has finally arrived, others uneasy with the idea that a narrative so old could be rewritten so decisively. For the investigators at the center of it all, the pressure is immense, every decision scrutinized, every assumption challenged, and the cold case that once symbolized failure now threatens to expose new vulnerabilities. As the legal process grinds forward, more pieces of the past are dragged into the light, not all of them flattering. Mistakes from 1981 are acknowledged in careful language, opportunities missed, biases unexamined, and the question shifts subtly from who did it to how the system allowed the truth to drift so far out of reach. Former detectives give interviews tinged with defensiveness and regret, explaining the limitations of their time, the chaos of a city divided, the sheer volume of cases competing for attention. Their words add texture, but not comfort, and for many listeners the realization is sobering. The mystery endured not because it was unsolvable, but because it was mishandled, misunderstood, quietly deprioritized. The forgotten clue becomes a symbol not just of hope but of institutional blindness, a reminder that answers can sit in plain sight while narratives rush past them. And still, despite the arrest, despite the evidence, something refuses to settle. The victim's story, once reduced to a headline, reasserts its complexity through the voices of those who knew her, describing a woman with private ambitions, unresolved tensions, moments of vulnerability that never made it into the file. These accounts complicate the clean arc of discovery and resolution, suggesting motives that are messier than the prosecution's timeline, relationships that blur the line between coincidence and causation. As the trial approaches, anticipation mixes with dread, because everyone involved senses that whatever the verdict, it will not fully quiet the questions that have haunted Berlin since that winter night. The cold case may be labeled closed, but closure itself feels provisional, conditional, a fragile construct built on evidence that waited decades to be heard, and the city braces for a reckoning that promises answers but may deliver something far more unsettling. The realization that even when the past is forced into the present, it does not always behave the way we expect. The courtroom fills slowly, not with spectacle but with a dense, contained energy, the kind that hums beneath polite conversation and measured footsteps, because everyone understands that this is not just a trial, it is a referendum on time itself. On whether the past can be summoned and compelled to speak truthfully after 4 decades of silence. The defendant sits composed, hands folded, face carefully neutral, a man who has had years to rehearse this moment without knowing it was coming, while across the aisle the victim's name is spoken again and again. Each repetition pulling her briefly into the present before letting her slip back into abstraction. Outside, cameras wait, hungry for a clean narrative, but inside the process is slower, heavier, every word weighed against the fragility of memory and the unforgiving permanence of the record. The prosecution opens not with emotion but with sequence, laying out the final known movements of a woman whose routine once made her invisible, emphasizing how predictability can be weaponized, how familiarity can lower defenses without either party noticing. They describe the winter streets, the early darkness, the narrow margins for witnesses, and then they introduce the forgotten clue, now elevated from footnote to cornerstone, an object that has traveled from obscurity to evidentiary centerpiece. Its journey is narrated carefully, almost reverently, as if acknowledging how close the truth came to being lost forever, and when the forensic expert takes the stand, the language shifts from narrative to precision, numbers and probabilities replacing speculation. Technology bridging decades with a confidence that borders on arrogance. The match, they say, is statistically overwhelming. The silence that follows is not disbelief, but recalibration, the audience adjusting to the idea that something once considered unknowable has been quantified. The defense responds by attacking not the science, but the story wrapped around it, reminding the court that evidence does not exist in a vacuum, that context matters, and that context erodes with time. They resurrect the ghosts of 1981, the rushed decisions, the missed interviews, the assumptions that hardened into doctrine, and they ask a question that lands uncomfortably well. If the clue was so decisive, why did it wait 40 years to matter? Witnesses from the original investigation take the stand, their voices steadier than their recollections, describing a city under pressure, a department stretched thin, the constant background noise of political tension and limited resources. Their testimony is not malicious, but it is revealing, painting a picture of systemic fatigue rather than individual failure, and the jury listens, aware that accountability here is diffuse, shared, difficult to assign cleanly. As days pass, the narrative fragments, no longer a single line from disappearance to arrest, but a web of intersecting paths, some leading nowhere, others looping back on themselves. Former neighbors describe half-remembered sounds, moments that felt insignificant at the time, but have since been polished into certainty by repetition. Coworkers recall subtle changes in behavior, hints of stress or distraction that might support almost any theory, depending on how they are framed. Each testimony adds texture without clarity, reinforcing the sense that truth in this case is not a solid object but a shifting outline, visible only from certain angles. The defendant's past is examined with clinical detachment, his movements mapped, his relationships dissected, and yet nothing surfaces that resembles a confession or a clear motive, only proximity and opportunity, the twin pillars of circumstantial cases. The most charged moment arrives not with a revelation, but with a contradiction. A timeline the prosecution has leaned on falters under cross-examination, a discrepancy measured in minutes that opens a gap wide enough for doubt to slip through. It is not exculpatory, but it is destabilizing, and the room feels it immediately, the way a structure creaks when a load shifts unexpectedly. The defense seizes on it, weaving a counter-narrative that suggests coincidence amplified by hindsight, a life ruined not by guilt but by statistical misfortune, and the desperation of a system eager for closure. Outside the courthouse, public opinion begins to tilt, social feeds filling with arguments that echo the trial's fault lines, some demanding justice at any cost, others warning against mistaking resolution for truth. For the victim's family, the proceedings are a study in restraint. They sit through technical debates that reduce a human life to data points and procedural errors, their expressions carefully controlled, grief long since metabolized into something quieter but no less persistent. In interviews, they speak of her as a person, not a case, recounting habits and humor, choices and regrets, details that never made it into the file but feel essential now, as if personality itself could tip the scales. Their presence complicates the legal drama, reminding everyone that the stakes are not abstract, that the cold case label was never just a category but a sentence imposed on those left behind. Midway through the trial, a surprise witness is called, someone who did not appear in the original investigation and whose relevance only emerged through the renewed scrutiny of old records. Their testimony is hesitant, fragmented, the product of a memory triggered late and reluctantly, and while it does not provide a smoking gun, it introduces a variable that neither side fully controls. A chance encounter. A vague recollection of seeing the defendant and the victim together in a context previously undocumented. The defense challenges it aggressively, pointing out the unreliability of delayed memory, the ease with which suggestion can masquerade as recall, but the seed is planted, and it alters the emotional landscape of the trial, adding a human element that raw data cannot easily counter. As closing arguments approach, the atmosphere tightens. The prosecution emphasizes convergence, how independent threads, weak alone, gain strength when woven together, urging the jury to consider the totality rather than fixating on imperfections. They speak of accountability deferred but not denied, of a cold case finally warmed by persistence and progress. The defense counters with restraint, cautioning against narrative momentum, reminding the jury that the desire for answers can be as dangerous as ignorance, especially when time has had decades to blur the line between what is known and what is believed. They frame the arrest as a triumph of technology but a failure of certainty, a moment where possibility has been mistaken for proof beyond reasonable doubt. When the jury retires, the city exhales and holds its breath all at once. Commentators fill the void with speculation, experts dissecting every argument, every expression, every pause, as if the outcome could be reverse-engineered from performance. Days pass. The defendant waits. The family waits. Investigators wait, aware that their legacy may hinge on a verdict they cannot influence. And beneath it all, the original question persists, stubborn and unresolved, cutting through legal rhetoric and forensic sophistication alike. Did the truth finally surface, or has it merely been reframed in a way that satisfies the present without fully honoring the past? The verdict, when it comes, is delivered without drama, words spoken plainly, their impact rippling outward in unpredictable ways. It resolves one question while igniting others, granting a measure of closure that feels both monumental and insufficient. Some hear justice. Others hear compromise. The cold case is officially closed in the language of the law, but the story does not end there because closure on paper does not erase doubt from memory, and as the courtroom empties and cameras capture the final images, Berlin is left to reckon not just with what happened in 1981, but with what it means to revisit history armed with new tools and old wounds. The past has been forced to answer, but its voice, filtered through time, technology, and human fallibility, carries an echo that refuses to fade, lingering in the collective consciousness as a reminder that even when a case is declared closed, the truth may still be negotiating its terms. The aftermath settles unevenly, like dust after a controlled explosion, because verdicts may conclude trials, but they rarely conclude stories, and in the days that follow the courtroom scene, the city begins to argue with itself in quieter, more persistent ways. Official statements emphasize procedure, integrity, the triumph of perseverance over time, yet beneath that language runs a current of unease, a sense that something fundamental has been disturbed without being fully repaired. The defendant is processed, photographed, reduced to a sequence of administrative steps, while the victim's name is invoked again in headlines that alternate between finality and doubt. Cold case closed, sharing space with questions that refuse to be buried. For investigators, there is no celebration, only a slow inventory of decisions, each one replayed in the mind, each one now part of a public record that will be scrutinized long after careers end. Inside the department, the case becomes a reference point almost immediately, cited in meetings and training sessions as both a success and a warning. An example of what persistence and technology can achieve and of how easily critical information can be overlooked when momentum favors louder theories. Younger officers listen intently, older ones shift in their seats, recognizing pieces of their own past work in the criticisms now circulating, and the forgotten clue is elevated to near-mythic status, a talisman of missed opportunity that carries with it an implicit accusation. How many other answers, people wonder, are sitting unexamined in boxes, waiting for the right context to make them speak. The question is uncomfortable because it suggests that resolution is often less about discovery than about attention, about where the light is pointed and for how long. The media, having exhausted the drama of the trial, turns inward, producing retrospectives that reframe the case yet again, this time as a story about institutions rather than individuals. Timelines are redrawn, errors highlighted, interviews replayed with captions that emphasize what was not asked, what was assumed, what slipped through the cracks. Former officials are invited to explain themselves, their answers measured and defensive, careful to balance accountability with the realities of a different era. They speak of limitations without using the word excuse, of context without conceding fault, and the public response is mixed, some sympathetic, others unforgiving. the gap between them reflecting a broader cultural tension about how much grace the past deserves. For the victim's family, the noise is exhausting. They had hoped for quiet after the verdict, a chance to grieve without commentary, but instead they find themselves navigating a new phase of visibility, their reactions parsed for authenticity, their silence interpreted as meaning. In private, they grapple with a complex relief, the burden of uncertainty partially lifted, replaced by the weight of specificity, a named perpetrator, a narrative endorsed by the law. Yet even this clarity feels conditional, dependent on trust in a process that has already proven fallible, and late at night the questions creep back in, softer now but no less insistent, asking whether the truth they have been given is complete or merely sufficient. The defense team does not retreat quietly. Appeals are filed, language sharpened, focusing not on innocence in the abstract but on procedural integrity, on whether a case resurrected after 40 years can ever meet the standard demanded of it. Legal scholars weigh in, debating the implications for other cold cases, warning of a precedent that could encourage overconfidence in technology and underestimation of time's corrosive effects. The argument is not that the verdict is wrong, but that it is fragile, balanced on evidence that waited decades to be understood, and therefore vulnerable to reinterpretation. The cold case, once dormant, now seems to generate energy on its own, pulling new conversations into its orbit. As months pass, details that never made it into the courtroom begin to surface in long-form investigations, journalists tracing peripheral figures, re-examining witness statements that were sidelined, exploring alternative theories with renewed vigor. None of these threads definitively contradict the official account, but they complicate it, suggesting that the story could have unfolded differently under slightly altered circumstances. A neighbor who moved away shortly after the disappearance, a co-worker whose alibi was accepted without verification, a tip that arrived too late to matter. Each element adds another layer of ambiguity, another reminder that the case's endurance is tied not just to what is known, but to what remains unknowable. The investigators at the center of the breakthrough feel this scrutiny acutely. Some give interviews, emphasizing the rigor of their work, the caution exercised at every step, the collaboration between old files and new science. Others withdraw, unwilling to engage in what feels like a perpetual cross-examination. In private conversations, doubts are admitted more freely, not about the evidence itself, but about the narrative cohesion imposed on it, the pressure to present a clean arc in a story defined by fragmentation. They know better than anyone how much interpretation is involved in turning data into meaning, and the awareness lingers, a quiet counterpoint to public declarations of certainty. Berlin absorbs it all with characteristic resilience, the case becoming part of its layered history, another story added to a city already thick with them. Tours mention it in passing, true crime podcasts dissect it episode by episode, academic panels reference it as a case study, and through this repetition the events of 1981 gain a strange afterlife, no longer just a disappearance, but a symbol of delayed reckoning. The streets where it began look different now, renovated, repurposed, their surfaces bearing no trace of what once happened there, and yet for those who know the story, the absence feels tangible, as if the city itself remembers even when it refuses to show it. In the background, the forgotten clue continues to exert its influence, prompting audits of evidence storage, renewed funding for cold case units, a quiet shift in priorities that acknowledges how easily the past can be misfiled. Technology advances further, promising even greater clarity, even as critics warn that each new tool carries its own blind spots. The balance between optimism and caution becomes a recurring theme, echoed in policy discussions and internal memos, the case serving as both inspiration and restraint. It is cited when budgets are approved and when procedures are revised, its legacy extending beyond the individuals directly involved. And still, for all this activity, a core ambiguity remains, a sense that the story's emotional center has not fully aligned with its legal conclusion. The victim's final moments, reconstructed through inference and probability, remain abstract, their texture imagined rather than known, and this gap continues to trouble those who seek a more visceral understanding. True closure, if such a thing exists, seems to hover just out of reach, undermined by the very distance that made the case cold in the first place. Time, once the enemy of investigation, now becomes its quiet accomplice, smoothing over contradictions, dulling outrage, allowing life to continue alongside unresolved questions. On anniversaries, small gatherings form, candles lit not in protest but in remembrance, gestures understated yet persistent. Speeches avoid certainty, focusing instead on the cost of waiting, on the human toll of unanswered questions, and in these moments the case feels less like a solved puzzle and more like an open wound that is scarred without healing cleanly. Participants speak of vigilance, of the responsibility to notice what seems ordinary, to question what is assumed, lessons drawn not from triumph but from delay. The cold case, officially closed, continues to teach, not through resolution, but through its resistance to being neatly contained. As the years move forward, the story recedes from headlines, replaced by newer mysteries, fresher tragedies, yet it remains accessible, a file that can be reopened at any moment in the public imagination. Its endurance is not a failure of justice, but a reflection of complexity, a reminder that some events imprint themselves too deeply to be erased by verdicts alone. The echo of 1981 persists, softened but not silenced, carried in conversations, policies, and private thoughts, and in that echo lies the enduring power of the case, not as a closed chapter, but as a cautionary tale about time, attention, and the fragile process by which truth is pursued, delayed, and sometimes only partially found. Time does what it always does next. It normalizes the extraordinary. The case drifts from the front pages to the intersections, then to footnotes, then to memory, but not evenly, not cleanly, because normalization does not mean resolution, it means absorption, the way a body learns to live around a foreign object it cannot remove. For some, the Berlin 1981 cold case is now a success story, a headline clipped and saved, proof that patience and progress can outlast silence. For others, it is an irritant, a reminder that justice arrived late and uncertain, that answers were delivered with conditions attached. And for a smaller group, quieter but more persistent, it remains unfinished business, a narrative that still leaks at the seams. Inside the prison system, the man at the center of it all adjusts to confinement with a composure that unsettles those who monitor him. He follows routines, avoids conflict, speaks rarely of the past unless prompted, and when he does, his language is careful, precise, as if he understands the power of phrasing better than most. Psychologists evaluate him, looking for cracks, for compulsions, for anything that might illuminate motive, but what they find is ambiguity, a profile that supports multiple interpretations without committing to any of them. This ambiguity feeds speculation, whispered conversations among staff, notes in files that mirror the uncertainty of the case itself. Guilt, here, is not a feeling but a legal status, and the difference matters more than anyone wants to admit. Beyond the walls, the victim's story continues to circulate in altered forms. Podcasts dramatize it, adding music and pacing that amplify suspense, sometimes smoothing over contradictions for the sake of narrative flow. Documentaries revisit the scenes, overlaying archival footage with modern commentary, their tone reverent but selective, choosing which doubts to foreground and which to leave implied. Each retelling nudges the story slightly, emphasizing one element over another, and over time these versions accumulate, creating a layered myth that coexists uneasily with the official record. Listeners and viewers argue not just about what happened, but about which version feels most true, an emotional metric that resists factual arbitration. Academia takes its turn. Criminology conferences dissect the case with clinical detachment, focusing on methodological lessons rather than moral ones. Papers are published about delayed justice, about the reliability of long-dormant evidence, about the psychology of witnesses whose memories are activated decades after the fact. Charts and models attempt to quantify uncertainty, to map confidence intervals around human recollection, and while these efforts add rigor, they also strip the story of its visceral core. The woman at the center becomes a variable, her disappearance a data point, and some bristle at this abstraction, sensing that something essential is being lost even as understanding increases. The police department implements reforms quietly, without fanfare. Evidence storage protocols are revised. Review cycles are shortened. Cold case units receive modest but symbolic boosts in funding. None of this is framed as an admission of failure, but the implication is clear. The past could have unfolded differently. Younger officers are trained to treat the mundane with suspicion, to document what feels obvious, to resist the gravitational pull of dominant theories. In hallways and break rooms, veterans tell stories of cases that slipped away, not always with regret, sometimes with resignation, acknowledging how easily certainty can masquerade as efficiency. Every so often, a new claim surfaces, a letter sent to a journalist, an anonymous tip posted online, asserting alternate explanations, naming other suspects, pointing to overlooked connections. Most are quickly debunked, their timelines collapsing under scrutiny, but a few linger just long enough to reignite discussion, to remind everyone how porous the boundaries of the story still are. Investigators review them out of obligation, more than hope, their responses measured, cautious, unwilling to reopen a wound without compelling cause. Each dismissal reinforces the official narrative while simultaneously underscoring how much effort it takes to keep it intact. For the family, life after the trial is quieter, but not simpler. Anniversaries still hurt. Ordinary moments still trigger intrusive questions. They are asked, repeatedly, whether they feel closure, and they struggle with the word, its implication that grief is a process with a defined endpoint. In private conversations, they describe something closer to equilibrium, a state where the unknown no longer dominates every thought but still occupies a permanent room in the mind. They visit the grave. They keep photographs. They speak her name without the reflexive pause that once accompanied it. This, they decide, is as close to peace as they are likely to get. Years on, a legal development threatens to disturb even this fragile balance. An appellate court agrees to hear a narrow procedural challenge, not because it is convinced of error, but because the implications extend beyond a single case. The news lands softly at first, buried beneath other headlines, but those who have followed the story closely feel the old tension return, the sense that nothing here is ever fully settled. Legal experts temper expectations, emphasizing how rare reversals are, how high the bar remains, but the mere act of review reopens the narrative, forcing everyone to revisit assumptions they had begun to set aside. The hearings are technical, almost bloodless, focused on standards and precedents rather than facts and feelings. Judges question attorneys about timelines and thresholds, about the balance between finality and fairness, about how the law should respond to evidence that becomes meaningful only with time. The arguments are abstract, yet their stakes are intimate, and observers sense that whatever the outcome, it will resonate beyond this one cold case, shaping how future investigations navigate the tension between innovation and restraint. When the decision comes, upholding the conviction while acknowledging imperfections, it satisfies neither extreme, reinforcing the sense that compromise, not certainty, is the system's default mode. Public reaction is muted this time. The story no longer shocks, it instructs. Commentators speak of it as a cautionary example, a reference point rather than a revelation. And yet, in quieter spaces, the case continues to provoke reflection, particularly among those who remember Berlin as it was in 1981, enclosed and anxious, a city accustomed to secrets. For them, the disappearance feels inseparable from that atmosphere, a product not just of individual action but of a collective condition, a time when invisibility was common and oversight fragmented. As decades accumulate, the line between past and present blurs further. New generations encounter the story without the emotional proximity that once defined it, their engagement analytical rather than visceral. They ask different questions, less about blame and more about process, about how societies remember and reinterpret unresolved harm. The cold case becomes a teaching tool, its longevity reframed as relevance, its ambiguity a feature rather than a flaw. This shift unsettles some and reassures others, reflecting a broader change in how uncertainty is tolerated. And still, late at night, when the city quiets and the layers of retelling fall away, the core image remains stubbornly simple: a woman stepping out into winter, expecting to return, a routine moment that fractures into absence. No amount of analysis fully restores that moment. No verdict or appeal rewinds the clock to where choice could still intervene. The case endures because of this irreversibility, because it reminds those who engage with it that justice, however diligently pursued, operates downstream of loss. In that sense, the Berlin 1981 cold case resists its own conclusion. It continues to exist not as a closed file but as a living reference, invoked whenever patience is tested, whenever technology promises too much, whenever certainty feels tempting. Its power lies not in the answers it produced, but in the questions it refuses to retire, questions about time, attention, and the cost of waiting too long to notice what is right in front of us. And as long as those questions remain relevant, the story remains unfinished, echoing quietly through a city that has learned, again and again, that the past does not stay buried just because we stop looking at it. What changes next is subtle, almost invisible, the way pressure shifts along a fault line long before anything breaks, because the case has entered a phase where it no longer belongs to investigators or courts but to culture itself, and culture is slower, messier, less accountable. The story seeps into conversations that are not explicitly about crime, into debates about memory, trust, and the authority of institutions, invoked as shorthand for a certain kind of unease. People say, "Remember Berlin 1981, as if it were a cautionary proverb rather than a disappearance, and the phrase carries with it an assumption that everyone understands what is meant, that truth can be delayed, that closure can be conditional, that certainty is often negotiated rather than discovered. Within law enforcement, the case continues to cast a long shadow. Cold case units across Germany quietly re-examine their own archives, not with the optimism of imminent breakthroughs, but with a more anxious motivation, the fear of what else might be sitting unrecognized in plain sight. Files are digitized, cross-referenced, reinterpreted, and while this process produces occasional successes, it also generates discomfort, because for every match found, dozens of near misses appear, moments where the data almost aligns but stops just short of confirmation. These almost answers accumulate, creating a background noise of unresolved potential that mirrors the Berlin case itself, reinforcing the idea that resolution is often the exception, not the rule. Detectives who worked the reopening speak less publicly now, their earlier interviews having been parsed to exhaustion. In private, some admit that the case altered how they perceive their profession, stripping away the illusion that persistence guarantees clarity. They talk about the weight of expectation, about how the label cold case closed became both validation and burden, a phrase that implied finality they never fully felt. One investigator confides that the most unsettling part was not discovering the forgotten clue, but realizing how easily it could have remained forgotten, how dependent truth can be on chance alignment rather than inevitability. The defendant's life inside the system settles into monotony, punctuated by legal correspondence and the occasional media inquiry. He maintains his innocence with consistency that is either admirable or chilling, depending on who is listening, and his supporters, few but vocal, frame him as a victim of narrative momentum, a man caught in the machinery of a system eager to correct its past mistakes. Their arguments circulate online, drawing attention not because they are persuasive, but because they exploit the ambiguity at the heart of the case. Each post, each comment, reopens micro-debates that mirror the larger one, creating an echo chamber where doubt is both currency and refuge. Meanwhile, those convinced of his guilt grow less interested in argument and more invested in symbolism. For them, the conviction represents not just accountability but a moral correction, a reassurance that time does not grant immunity. They point to the evidence, to the convergence of threads, to the improbability of coincidence, and they bristle at what they perceive as indulgence toward uncertainty. To accept doubt, they argue, is to reopen wounds unnecessarily, to privilege abstract fairness over tangible harm. The tension between these positions hardens, not into hostility, but into parallel realities that rarely intersect meaningfully. The victim herself becomes increasingly abstract in this landscape, her individuality overshadowed by the debates conducted in her name. Efforts to restore her presence take various forms: a small memorial plaque installed near her former building, a scholarship established in her name, an annual lecture on unresolved violence. These gestures are sincere, yet they struggle against the gravitational pull of the case's procedural complexity, which continues to dominate discourse. The risk, some observers note, is that remembrance becomes performative, a way to signal concern without engaging with the deeper discomfort the story provokes. Education systems begin to reference the case indirectly, folded into curricula about ethics, law, and history. Students analyze it as a scenario, asked to identify decision points, to debate alternative outcomes, to consider how they might have acted with the information available at the time. These exercises are valuable, but they also sanitize the story, converting lived trauma into hypothetical reasoning. The disappearance becomes a problem to be solved rather than an absence to be felt, and this shift reflects a broader societal trend toward intellectualizing pain as a way of managing it. Technological optimism surges again, driven by advances in artificial intelligence and predictive analytics, with proponents suggesting that future cold cases will not remain cold for long. Algorithms promise to identify patterns invisible to human investigators, to flag anomalies automatically, to reduce reliance on memory and intuition. The Berlin case is cited as proof of concept, an early example of how data can resurrect the past. Critics counter that technology did not solve the case on its own, that it required human curiosity and judgment to recognize the clue's significance, and that without those qualities, even the most advanced systems will simply process ignorance more efficiently. This debate spills into policy discussions, funding decisions, and public forums, where the case is invoked by both sides to support opposing conclusions. Its flexibility as an argument is part of its enduring power. It can be framed as a triumph of innovation or as a warning about over-reliance on tools. Each framing emphasizes different aspects while downplaying others, and the result is not consensus, but a richer, more contested understanding of what the case represents. On a more intimate level, the story continues to surface unexpectedly in the lives of those peripherally connected to it. Former neighbors encounter each other years later and realize they share this history, prompting conversations that begin awkwardly and end unresolved. A retired detective dreams about missed details, waking with the uneasy sense that something important remains unarticulated. A journalist who covered the trial revisits old notes and wonders whether certain questions were never asked because they seemed too small at the time. These private reckonings rarely become public, but they contribute to the case's persistence, sustaining it beyond official channels. The city itself bears the imprint in subtle ways. Urban planners rename streets, renovate buildings, erase physical traces, yet the narrative clings to certain locations, resisting redevelopment's attempt at neutrality. People slow down unconsciously when passing the building where she lived, even if they cannot articulate why. Tour guides lower their voices when mentioning the area, acknowledging an atmosphere that is more felt than seen. Berlin has always been a city layered with memory, and this story simply adds another sedimentary layer, one that future generations will walk over without knowing its composition. As years stretch on, the urgency that once surrounded the case dissipates, replaced by a quieter, more philosophical engagement. Commentators speak less about guilt and innocence and more about what the story reveals about human systems, about how societies allocate attention and tolerate uncertainty. The cold case becomes less a question and more a mirror, reflecting back the values and anxieties of whoever looks into it. This transformation is not linear or unanimous, but it marks a shift from reactive to reflective, from demand to inquiry. Yet even in this reflective phase, moments of rupture occur. A new technology produces a reanalysis of old data, confirming existing conclusions while raising fresh questions. A former witness passes away, taking with them unrecorded nuances that no transcript can recover. A forgotten document surfaces in a private archive. Interesting but inconclusive, enough to stir discussion without altering outcomes. Each event briefly accelerates the pulse of the narrative before it settles again, reinforcing the pattern of anticipation followed by restraint. The case's endurance begins to feel less like an anomaly and more like a case study in how stories persist when they intersect with unresolved themes. It touches on trust in institutions, the reliability of memory, the ethics of delayed justice, the limits of technology, and the human need for narrative coherence. These themes do not age out. They adapt, finding new relevance as contexts change. And so the Berlin 1981 cold case remains available, ready to be reactivated whenever a new development elsewhere echoes its contours. At its core, however, the story remains anchored to that single, irrevocable absence. No amount of reinterpretation alters the fact that a life ended without explanation at the moment it mattered most. Everything that follows, the investigations, the trials, the debates, the reforms, unfolds downstream of that loss. This recognition tempers even the most abstract discussions, grounding them in a reminder that systems exist to serve people, not narratives, and that when they fail, the consequences reverberate far beyond any single verdict. And so the case continues, not forward toward a definitive conclusion, but outward, diffusing into disciplines, conversations, and memories that were never part of the original file. It becomes a reference point, a warning, a lesson, and sometimes a distraction, depending on how it is used. Its power lies not in the certainty it achieved, but in the uncertainty it normalized, teaching those who engage with it that some questions persist not because they lack answers, but because their answers, once found, complicate more than they resolve. What follows is not a revelation but a quiet recalibration, a period where the story stops moving forward and starts deepening, settling into the collective subconscious in ways that are harder to track but no less consequential. The case no longer announces itself with urgency. Instead, it surfaces obliquely, in side comments, in footnotes, in the assumptions people carry when they talk about justice delayed. It becomes part of the background noise of civic life, a reference point invoked to justify patience or skepticism depending on who is speaking, and this ambiguity gives it a second life, less dramatic but more durable. Within legal circles, the Berlin 1981 cold case becomes shorthand for a particular kind of evidentiary risk, cited during strategy sessions and continuing education seminars. Lawyers speak of it in careful tones, emphasizing its uniqueness while quietly acknowledging how easily its contours could repeat elsewhere. The lesson is framed as caution rather than fear, but the subtext is unmistakable. Time does not simply preserve evidence, it transforms it, and every transformation introduces interpretation. Judges, too, internalize this awareness, their rulings increasingly attentive to the long tail of consequences that accompany decisions made under the banner of closure. The man at the center of the conviction ages in small, observable increments, his appearance changing in ways that feel symbolic even if they are not intended to be. Gray spreads through his hair. His posture softens. The certainty of middle age gives way to the slower rhythms of confinement. Appeals taper off, not because arguments are exhausted, but because momentum is, and his name recedes from public consciousness, replaced by newer controversies, fresher faces. Yet in letters written from prison, fragments of his voice persist, measured, insistent, reiterating a version of events that has never been fully articulated, but never fully abandoned either. To those who receive these letters, they read less like pleas and more like artifacts, documents of a parallel narrative running alongside the official one. For the victim's family, time exerts a different pressure. Distance dulls some edges while sharpening others, and memories once anchored to specific details become more impressionistic, anchored to feeling instead. They speak less often about what happened and more about who she was, reclaiming her from the machinery of the case that threatened to define her solely by her disappearance. In doing so, they resist the gravitational pull of the cold case narrative, insisting on a version of remembrance that is not contingent on resolution. This act, quiet and personal, stands in contrast to the public's ongoing fascination with the procedural aspects, highlighting a divide between lived grief and collective curiosity. The city's relationship with the story continues to evolve. Younger Berliners encounter it without the emotional residue that once accompanied its mention, their understanding shaped by documentaries and articles rather than first-hand memory. For them, the case is less a wound and more a lesson, an example woven into discussions about transparency and institutional trust. They analyze it with a distance that would have seemed unthinkable to those who lived through the initial shock, and this generational shift subtly alters the tone of public discourse, replacing urgency with analysis, outrage with inquiry. At the same time, the infrastructure built in response to the case begins to show its own patterns. Cold case units, now better funded and more visible, face rising expectations. Their success is measured not just by convictions but by speed. Pressure mounts to demonstrate return on investment, and this urgency risks recreating the very conditions that once sidelined the forgotten clue. Some investigators push back, advocating for slower, more reflective approaches, warning that the desire to avoid another Berlin 1981 can itself become a source of error. Their caution introduces a paradox. The case meant to teach patience now threatens to incentivize haste. Media coverage adapts accordingly. True crime narratives, once content to dramatize mystery, begin to emphasize process, accountability, and ethical uncertainty. The Berlin case is frequently cited as a pivot point in this shift, a moment when audiences grew more interested in how stories are told than in how they end. Producers and writers speak openly about the responsibility that comes with resurrecting old pain for entertainment, and while this awareness does not eliminate sensationalism, it tempers it, adding layers of self-reflection that complicate consumption. In academic spaces, the case continues to inspire interdisciplinary study. Psychologists examine the long-term effects of unresolved narratives on communities. Sociologists explore how delayed justice reshapes trust in institutions. Historians situate the disappearance within the broader context of a divided Berlin, arguing that the city's political fragmentation created blind spots that extended beyond border control and into everyday life. These analyses do not converge on a single conclusion. Instead, they proliferate, each adding a perspective that expands the story rather than narrowing it. Occasionally, a new detail emerges from an unexpected source. A private diary surfaces during an estate sale, its contents tangential but evocative, mentioning the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that permeated the neighborhood at the time. A former coworker gives an interview late in life, offering a recollection that contradicts nothing and explains little, yet somehow alters the emotional temperature of the narrative. These additions are not breakthroughs. They are brushstrokes, subtle shifts in tone that remind observers how incomplete any single account must be. The legal status of the case remains stable, but stability does not equate to finality. Scholars debate hypothetical scenarios, asking how the same evidence might be evaluated under different standards, in different jurisdictions, at different moments in history. These exercises are not meant to undermine the verdict but to test its resilience, to see how it holds up under conceptual stress. The results are mixed, reinforcing the sense that certainty here is context-dependent, a product of alignment rather than inevitability. For investigators who cut their teeth on the case, retirement brings a new relationship with the past. Freed from institutional loyalty, some speak more candidly about their doubts and convictions, acknowledging the emotional toll of carrying a story that refuses to settle. They describe moments of confidence followed by long stretches of uncertainty, the oscillation between belief and skepticism that defined their experience. Their reflections add depth to the public understanding, revealing the human dimension of work often portrayed as procedural and detached. The case's influence even extends into policy beyond criminal justice. Discussions about archival preservation, data interoperability, and interagency communication reference it as an example of what happens when information is siloed or deprioritized. In this way, the disappearance continues to shape decisions far removed from its original context, its impact diffusing into areas where its origin is barely acknowledged. This diffusion underscores a central irony. The case endures not because it remains unsolved, but because its partial resolution exposed vulnerabilities that resonate widely. Public memory, too, adapts. Memorials are visited less frequently, but when they are, the gestures feel more intentional, less performative. The story is told more softly, with an emphasis on listening rather than declaring. In classrooms, students debate not who is guilty, but how societies decide when to stop asking questions. These conversations lack the heat of earlier years, but they carry a different kind of weight, one rooted in reflection rather than reaction. And still, beneath these layers of analysis and adaptation, the original absence persists, unaltered by reinterpretation. No new framework changes the fact that a woman vanished into the ordinary flow of a winter evening, her life intersecting with history in a way that would only be understood decades later. This simplicity anchors the story, preventing it from drifting entirely into abstraction. It serves as a reminder that behind every systemic lesson lies a personal rupture that cannot be fully translated into theory or policy. As the narrative continues to diffuse, it becomes harder to say where the case ends and where its influence begins. It appears in the caution exercised by a detective reviewing an old file, in the hesitation of a prosecutor weighing a marginal piece of evidence, in the skepticism of a juror confronted with a story that promises closure too neatly. These echoes are subtle, but they are cumulative, shaping behavior in ways that rarely make headlines. In this phase, the Berlin 1981 cold case functions less as a story and more as a lens, a way of seeing patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. It teaches attentiveness to the mundane, respect for uncertainty, and humility in the face of time's distortions. It resists being framed as either triumph or failure, insisting instead on complexity, on the coexistence of progress and regret. And so it remains present, not as an active investigation or a courtroom drama, but as a quiet influence, threading through decisions and discussions that will never explicitly reference it. Its power lies in this invisibility, in the way it shapes thought without demanding acknowledgement. The case has moved beyond its own boundaries, becoming part of the architecture of how truth is pursued and how doubt is tolerated, and in doing so, it ensures that the night in 1981 continues to matter, not because it can be fully explained, but because it cannot. What emerges next is a slow erosion of certainty, not dramatic enough to make headlines, but steady enough to alter the landscape, because time does not just pass, it reframes, and as the years accumulate after the verdict, the Berlin 1981 cold case begins to feel less like an answer and more like a pressure point. The story no longer asks who did it so much as what it did to those who touched it, and the effects ripple outward in ways that are difficult to trace back to a single source. The case becomes a reference for discomfort, a reminder that resolution can coexist with doubt without either fully canceling the other. In legal archives, the transcripts age differently than expected. Words that once sounded definitive now read as cautious, hedged, aware of their own fragility. Future attorneys studying the case note how often witnesses qualify their statements, how frequently phrases like "to the best of my recollection" appear, and how these linguistic markers of uncertainty were once treated as background noise rather than foreground evidence. This realization does not undermine the trial. It contextualizes it, reframing confidence as a function of necessity rather than absolute truth. The law, they conclude, did what it could with what it had, and the gap between that effort and certainty becomes the real subject of study. The investigators most closely associated with the breakthrough continue to be invited to speak, but the tone of these invitations shifts. Where once they were asked to describe triumph, they are now asked to explain doubt, to articulate how it feels to live with a conclusion that is defensible but never entirely comfortable. Some answer candidly, describing the mental discipline required to accept imperfection without slipping into paralysis. Others deflect, preferring to emphasize institutional progress rather than personal ambivalence. The contrast between these responses becomes part of the case's evolving narrative, illustrating how individuals adapt differently to unresolved tension. Inside the prison, the man convicted becomes less a symbol and more a fixture, a presence folded into the routines of the institution. New inmates do not recognize his name. Guards rotate. Time levels notoriety into anonymity. And yet, for those who know the story, his continued existence carries an unsettling weight, a reminder that the consequences of the case are ongoing, not frozen at the moment of arrest. He participates in programs, follows rules, occasionally offers reflections that are recorded and archived, his words treated with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Whether these reflections reveal anything essential remains an open question, one that may never be resolved simply because the context in which it could be resolved no longer exists. Public engagement with the case becomes more selective. Interest spikes when anniversaries align with broader conversations about justice or technology, then fades again, absorbed into the constant churn of information. When it resurfaces, it does so in fragments. A quote shared online, a clip from a documentary replayed out of context, a statistic cited without explanation. These fragments detach the story from its chronological flow, allowing people to engage with pieces of it without confronting the whole. This fragmentation mirrors the investigation itself, reinforcing the idea that understanding here is always partial. The victim's presence, paradoxically, becomes more diffuse and more intimate at the same time. She appears less frequently as a headline and more often as a name spoken in quieter spaces, in classrooms, in community discussions about safety and memory. Her story is used to illustrate vulnerability, the way ordinary routines can intersect with extraordinary harm. In these retellings, the emphasis shifts away from mystery and toward empathy, a subtle but meaningful change that reflects a broader cultural fatigue with sensationalism. The cold case label recedes slightly, replaced by language that centers loss rather than intrigue. Policymakers continue to reference the case, but their focus narrows. Instead of sweeping reforms, they pursue incremental adjustments, small changes to evidence handling, interdepartmental communication, review protocols. Each change is justified as a lesson learned, though rarely attributed explicitly to Berlin 1981. The case's influence becomes implicit, embedded in systems rather than acknowledged in speeches. This quiet integration suggests a maturation of its impact, a move from reaction to incorporation. At the same time, critics remain vigilant. They argue that the story's absorption into institutional memory risks dulling its edge, turning a cautionary tale into a box-checking exercise. They warn that reverence for the case can become complacency, that citing it as a lesson learned does not guarantee the lesson is applied under pressure. Their skepticism keeps the narrative from settling too comfortably, ensuring that it remains a source of tension rather than reassurance. In cultural spaces, artists and writers reinterpret the case obliquely, avoiding direct references while drawing on its themes. A novel explores the idea of delayed revelation without naming names. A film uses the structure of a cold case to examine memory rather than crime. These works resonate with audiences who recognize the contours of the story without needing explicit confirmation. Through art, the case escapes its factual boundaries, becoming a metaphor for unresolved pasts of all kinds. This metaphorical turn further distances the story from its origins, and some worry that abstraction risks erasure, that the specific circumstances of 1981 Berlin will be smoothed into universality. Others argue the opposite, that metaphor preserves relevance by allowing the core questions to adapt. The debate mirrors earlier disagreements about closure and certainty, suggesting that the case's central tension has simply migrated to a new domain. Occasionally, a former witness or peripheral figure passes away, prompting brief reconsiderations of what was known and what was lost with them. Obituaries mention their connection to the case in a line or two, enough to reopen curiosity without satisfying it. Each death closes a door that was already only partially open, reinforcing the sense that the window for absolute clarity has long since passed. The story becomes increasingly asymmetrical, with more questions than people left to answer them. For those who lived in Berlin in 1981, the case continues to function as a marker of that era's atmosphere, a reminder of a time when uncertainty felt structural rather than episodic. They recall the feeling of enclosure, the heightened awareness of boundaries, and they see parallels between that environment and the investigative blind spots that allowed the disappearance to linger unresolved. This contextual reading adds depth to the narrative, situating it within a broader social psychology rather than isolating it as an anomaly. As younger generations engage with the story, they bring different expectations. Accustomed to rapid information and constant updates, they struggle with the idea of a mystery spanning decades, and their impatience reshapes how the case is discussed. They ask why it took so long, why systems failed to connect dots that now seem obvious. These questions are valid, but they also risk flattening complexity, judging the past by standards that did not yet exist. The tension between these perspectives fuels ongoing dialogue, keeping the case alive as a subject of debate. Through all of this, the narrative resists closure not because of new evidence, but because of accumulated interpretation. Each layer of analysis adds weight without necessarily adding clarity, creating a dense sediment of meaning that is difficult to excavate. The Berlin 1981 cold case becomes less about discovery and more about endurance, about how stories persist when they are too consequential to forget and too ambiguous to resolve cleanly. In this endurance, there is a quiet transformation. The case stops demanding attention and starts shaping it, influencing how people listen to new stories, how they assess claims of certainty, how they weigh the cost of waiting against the risk of acting too soon. Its legacy is no longer tied to a specific outcome, but to a sensibility, a heightened awareness of how fragile truth can be when stretched across time. And so the story continues, not advancing toward a final revelation, but deepening into a kind of shared unease that does not seek to be resolved. The winter night in 1981 remains the fixed point around which everything else orbits, unchanged and unreachable, while the interpretations spin outward, adapting to new contexts and concerns. In that orbit lies the enduring power of the case, not as a closed chapter or an open question, but as a persistent presence that refuses to be simplified, reminding anyone who encounters it that some truths do not arrive fully formed. And some absences continue to speak long after the noise around them has faded. What happens next is not discovery but fatigue, a collective weariness that settles in once the story has been told too many times to shock and too imperfectly to satisfy, and this fatigue reshapes how the Berlin 1981 cold case is carried forward. It is no longer argued with urgency. It is handled carefully, like an object that has proven it can cut both ways. People still reference it, but with qualifiers, with pauses, with an awareness that certainty here has sharp edges. The case has matured into something less combustible and more enduring, a long-burning ember rather than an open flame. In newsrooms, editors hesitate before greenlighting another revisit. They ask what would be added, what angle has not already been exhausted, and often the answer is nothing substantial, just a reconfiguration of familiar elements. When coverage does happen, it is stripped of spectacle, framed as reflection rather than revelation. Journalists write about the case as a turning point, a moment when the genre of crime reporting itself began to question its appetite for neat endings. The language becomes more restrained, less declarative, and this tonal shift signals a broader recalibration in how unresolved harm is narrated. The legal system absorbs the case in a similar way. It enters commentaries and footnotes, cited less frequently but with greater precision. Judges reference it obliquely when cautioning against overconfidence, prosecutors invoke it when arguing for patience, defense attorneys when warning about the seduction of retrospective clarity. Each citation pulls the case into a new context, subtly altering its meaning. Over time, it becomes less a specific event and more a principle, an illustration of how law grapples with time's distortions. Inside police departments, the case influences behavior in ways that are rarely articulated. Investigators linger longer over mundane details. Supervisors insist on redundant documentation. Junior officers are encouraged to question assumptions that once would have been waved through. These changes are incremental, almost bureaucratic, but they accumulate, shaping a culture that is marginally more cautious, marginally more attentive. Whether this leads to better outcomes is difficult to measure, but the effort itself reflects an awareness born from the case's long shadow. The victim's name surfaces less often in public discourse, but when it does, it carries a quieter weight. Community groups reference her story in discussions about safety and memory, not as a warning, but as a reminder of vulnerability. The emphasis shifts away from fear and toward responsibility, toward the idea that disappearance is not just a crime but a rupture that reverberates through ordinary life. In these contexts, the cold case label feels inadequate, too procedural for what is being acknowledged. For the family, this quieter phase brings a complicated relief. The spotlight has moved on, allowing space for private remembrance without constant interruption. Yet the absence of attention also underscores how easily stories recede, how quickly even the most consuming mysteries can become background noise. They live with a dual awareness: gratitude that the case is no longer a public spectacle, and unease at how thin the line is between remembrance and forgetting. They learn to carry the story internally, without the external validation of headlines. The man convicted becomes increasingly distant from the narrative, his presence reduced to occasional mentions in legal updates or academic discussions. His identity is no longer the focal point. Instead, he exists as a reference, a variable in debates about evidence and time. This abstraction strips the story of its antagonist, leaving behind a more unsettling emptiness. Without a clear villain to absorb attention, the case turns inward, forcing those who engage with it to confront systemic questions rather than personal ones. Cultural reinterpretations continue, but they grow more abstract. Artists and writers draw inspiration from the idea of a case that refuses to settle, exploring themes of deferred understanding and incomplete truth. These works resonate precisely because they avoid specifics, allowing audiences to project their own unresolved experiences onto the framework. In this way, the Berlin case dissolves into a broader meditation on absence, its details fading while its emotional contours remain vivid. The passage of time also alters the physical landscape of memory. Buildings connected to the case are renovated or demolished. Streets are repaved. The visual cues that once anchored the story erode, leaving behind a geography that no longer aligns with the narrative. For those who seek to retrace events, this transformation is disorienting, emphasizing how memory must now rely on description rather than place. The city moves on, not deliberately, but inevitably, its evolution indifferent to unresolved histories. Academic interest persists, but it becomes more specialized. Scholars focus on narrow questions: how delayed evidence is weighed, how narratives harden over time, how communities process unresolved loss. Conferences include panels on the case, not because it is sensational, but because it is illustrative, a complex example that resists simplification. These discussions are thoughtful, measured, and often inconclusive, mirroring the case itself. Occasionally, a new technology is proposed as a potential game changer, prompting brief speculation about whether the case might be re-examined yet again. Experts temper expectations, noting that the limiting factor is no longer data but context, the absence of living witnesses, the erosion of contemporaneous records. The idea of reopening the case feels less like hope and more like compulsion, a reflex to act even when action promises little. This recognition marks a shift from earlier years, when reopening was equated with progress. Public memory adapts accordingly. The case is no longer framed as a mystery waiting to be solved, but as an example of how some mysteries evolve into something else entirely. It becomes a story about endurance rather than discovery, about how questions persist even when answers are declared. This reframing does not diminish its impact. It changes its texture, making it less volatile but more pervasive. In private moments, those who have followed the case closely sometimes experience a resurgence of curiosity, triggered by a line in an article or a chance remark. They revisit old materials, not expecting revelation, but seeking coherence, a sense that the story can be held in the mind without constant friction. Often, they come away with the same conclusion: that coherence here is provisional, a temporary alignment of interpretation that will inevitably shift again. As the case settles into this phase of quiet persistence, it becomes clear that its longevity is not accidental. It endures because it touches on fundamental tensions that do not resolve with time: the desire for certainty versus the reality of ambiguity, the need for closure versus the cost of forcing it, the faith in systems versus their evident limitations. These tensions ensure that the story remains relevant, ready to be invoked whenever similar questions arise elsewhere. The Berlin 1981 cold case, now decades removed from its origin, occupies a strange position. It is neither active nor dormant, neither resolved nor open, but suspended in a state of acknowledged incompleteness. This suspension is uncomfortable, yet it is also instructive, reminding those who engage with it that some stories do not move toward endings so much as they expand outward, influencing thought long after their central events have passed. And in that expansion, the case finds its final form, not as a narrative with a definitive arc, but as a presence that shapes how new narratives are approached. It teaches restraint, skepticism, and a tolerance for unanswered questions. It cautions against the temptation to declare victory too quickly and against the despair of assuming truth is forever lost. In doing so, it ensures that the winter night in 1981 continues to matter, not as a puzzle to be solved once and for all, but as a reference point for how societies remember, question, and live with what they cannot fully explain. What comes after endurance is inheritance, the moment when a story is no longer actively carried by those who lived it but is instead passed, quietly and imperfectly, to those who did not, and this transition changes the Berlin 1981 cold case in ways that are subtle but profound. The case is no longer remembered so much as it is received, absorbed through secondary accounts, through curricula, through cultural shorthand, and in this transfer something essential shifts. The emotional immediacy thins, replaced by structure, by interpretation, by lessons distilled for reuse. The disappearance becomes less an event and more a framework, a way of thinking about time, responsibility, and the limits of knowing. In universities, the case is now taught by people who were not yet born when it happened. They approach it methodically, situating it among other delayed investigations, comparing procedural outcomes, mapping institutional responses. Students listen attentively, taking notes, debating hypotheticals, their engagement earnest but abstract. For them, the long gap between disappearance and arrest is remarkable, almost exotic, a feature of a slower, less connected era. They struggle to imagine a world where information did not circulate instantly, where mistakes could remain buried simply because no system existed to surface them. This imaginative gap alters how the case is understood, flattening some complexities while highlighting others. The police officers entering the force now encounter the case as part of their professional mythology. It is referenced during training not with reverence but with practicality, a caution embedded in protocols and checklists. Do not assume irrelevance. Do not rush classification. Do not let volume eclipse detail. These maxims are repeated often enough to feel obvious, and that familiarity is both their strength and their risk. When lessons become routine, they risk becoming invisible, absorbed into habit rather than actively recalled. The case's influence persists, but it must compete with newer examples, fresher warnings, in an environment where attention is always divided. The city's official memory continues to compress. Municipal archives maintain the record, but public markers remain sparse, understated, almost hesitant. There is no grand monument, no annual ceremony mandated by tradition, only quiet acknowledgments that surface intermittently. This restraint reflects a broader discomfort with monumentalizing unresolved pain, a preference for allowing the story to remain personal rather than codified. Yet this very subtlety means that the case can be overlooked by those who do not seek it out, its presence dependent on curiosity rather than confrontation. Media representations adapt once more. Streaming platforms release serialized content that references the case indirectly, borrowing its structure while avoiding its specifics. Audiences consume these stories quickly, moving on to the next recommendation, and the Berlin disappearance becomes one influence among many, diluted but persistent. In this ecosystem, the case competes with endless narratives of mystery and resolution, its uniqueness softened by repetition elsewhere. What once felt singular now feels emblematic, and this shift changes how it is valued. For the victim's family, inheritance is complicated. They watch as the story is retold by people with no personal stake, its contours reshaped to fit broader themes. Some retellings feel respectful, others feel opportunistic, and distinguishing between the two requires energy they no longer wish to spend. They choose selectively when to engage, when to correct, when to remain silent. Their silence is sometimes misinterpreted as acceptance, sometimes as retreat, but in truth it reflects a recalibration of ownership. The story is no longer theirs to control, and recognizing that is both painful and freeing. The man convicted fades further into obscurity, his life unfolding within a system that outlasts public interest. His existence becomes bureaucratic, marked by reviews and reports rather than headlines. For those who continue to argue his innocence, this fading is itself evidence of injustice, proof that the system prefers quiet over scrutiny once attention wanes. For others, it is simply the natural progression of accountability, the transition from spectacle to sentence. The debate persists, but its volume diminishes, carried by a smaller, more insular group. Technology continues to evolve, raising hypothetical possibilities that brush against the case without quite touching it. New forensic methods promise greater precision, but experts acknowledge that precision without context is limited. The materials available from 1981 have already yielded what they can, and further analysis risks producing diminishing returns. This acknowledgement marks a shift from earlier optimism to a more tempered realism, an acceptance that not all progress can be retroactively applied. The future, it seems, will benefit more than the past. In policy circles, the case's legacy becomes diffuse. It is cited occasionally, but more often its influence is embedded implicitly in guidelines and best practices. Decision-makers reference principles rather than examples, focusing on outcomes rather than origins. This abstraction ensures continuity, but erases specificity, and with it some of the emotional force that once drove reform. The case survives institutionally, but as an idea rather than a story. Culturally, the narrative continues to mutate. Writers and filmmakers use it as a tonal reference, a way to signal seriousness or depth without recounting details. Phrases associated with the case enter common usage, detached from their source, and the story's vocabulary outlives its plot. This linguistic inheritance is subtle but powerful, shaping how people talk about unresolved harm even when they no longer remember why those phrases mattered. As decades pass, the original winter of 1981 recedes further, its textures harder to reconstruct. Weather records replace memory. Photographs replace presence. The emotional landscape of that time becomes speculative, inferred from artifacts rather than lived experience. This distance changes the nature of empathy, shifting it from identification to imagination. People feel for the victim not because they remember her, but because they recognize the pattern her disappearance represents. Occasionally, anniversaries prompt renewed attention, but these moments are quieter now, marked by reflective essays rather than urgent appeals. Writers ask what it means to remember responsibly, how to honor loss without exploiting it, how to acknowledge uncertainty without surrendering to cynicism. The Berlin case is central to these questions, not because it provides answers, but because it embodies the tension between them. The story's persistence reveals something uncomfortable, that societies do not simply move on from unresolved harm, they metabolize it, incorporating it into their structures, their language, their expectations. The cold case becomes part of the cultural bloodstream, influencing reactions to new events in ways that are difficult to trace back to a single source. When another disappearance makes headlines, comparisons are drawn instinctively, lessons invoked reflexively, and the shadow of 1981 stretches forward again. In this inherited phase, the case no longer seeks resolution. It seeks relevance, and it finds it not through new evidence, but through resonance. It continues to matter because the conditions it exposed have not